You'll recall that a couple of our fertiliser companies have taken a product off the market voluntarily last week, not because of any human health risk, but because we were able to determine that in some dairy products, the fact that farmers had been using this fertiliser product was being manifest. Parts well under 1 part per million, but nevertheless they were traceable. And given there's no international standard for that detection, we thought it better to take it off the market before and work to get an international agreement about acceptable levels. Unfortunately, due to a badly informed Asian Wall Street Journal article written by a New Zealand-based journalist, we've had a small crisis with the markets of China and Taiwan, which, as you'll appreciate, represent billions of dollars of export revenues. So I think that the key thing is that we're now working between the New Zealand government and the government of China and the government of Chinese Taipei to provide any assurance, but there's no human food safety risk here. It's really a technical issue, and the reason it's come off the market is because we didn't want it to grow into a potential trade issue. Happy to address any questions, but just a topical issue that we've been dealing with. We're refreshing our strategic framework, which drives all of the industry investment into research and development. We're basically saying that we need a sustainable dairy industry. And what does a sustainable dairy industry mean? It's an industry which is competitive. Bear in mind, we make 95 cents in every dollar through exporting. We need to be competitive with other dairy industries around the world that are in the international market. At the same time, we need to be responsible. We need to grow responsibly, we need to farm responsibly. And being responsible is about things such as environmental stewardship and making sure that we are managing our natural resources so that our children, our children's children can continue to have them and take advantage of them. Because of the pressures of time, I'm not going to go too far into this, but this one-pager around our new strategic refresh is on the Dairy NZ website. I'll just show you another sort of graph which really summarises in many ways what the dairy industry is hoping to achieve over the next 10 to 20 years. As I said, you'll see that our financial contribution to the country has more than doubled between the years of 1990 and 2010. However, at the same time, our environmental footprint has basically kept pace with that. What we really need to do into the future is we need to continue to grow our financial contribution to New Zealand. And we're going to do that through two things, really. One is by more milk, where we can do so responsibly, but also it's going to be about adding more and more value to the products that we sell. At the current time, about 40% of New Zealand dairy products are classified as value add. We need to raise that percentage to increase our financial and our economic contribution to the country. But the kicker here is at the same time we have to find a way that we break that connection between growth and environmental footprint. And we need to find a way to hold our footprint where it is and to decrease it over time. So in a sense, that's the key strategic challenge for the industry, to be the economic engine of New Zealand while at the same time continuing to get on top of and reduce our environmental footprint. And that's true whether we're talking about climate change and carbon or whether we're talking about water quality or water use, any of those things. So what are the challenges for the dairy sector in this area of water quality? In some ways it's quite simple. We've got to keep our animals out of waterways, and we've got to use riparian management as a way to minimise our impact. We've got to make sure that dairy cow effluent, sorry to raise such an issue at lunchtime, is managed in a way that there is no risk of contamination to water from cow effluent. And probably the most challenging issue is the diffuse loss. When we're applying fertiliser and cow urine to pasture, we've got to make sure that the amount of that which makes its way through into ground and surface water is not unsustainable. So those are the three challenges. The problem is that addressing them is in some ways simple, but in other ways it can be quite complicated. I guess the point about these is if we get it wrong, it means that other people's interests, or all of our interests in water, can get compromised. We all have interests in water. They may be health, they may be cultural, they may be recreation, they may be aesthetic, or they may be economic. The problem with water quality is not that people look at a river and say it's got too much nitrogen floating in it. They look at it and say, I can't fish in it, or I can't swim in it, or I can't gather mahinga kai in this river. And so that is the connection between the science of water quality and the values and interests that we hold in it. I'm not going to go too far into this, it's neither the time nor the place, but just to say the industry is investing millions and millions of dollars across these various areas, effluent, stock exclusion and nutrient management. I think it's fair to say that effluent is heading in the right direction. Stock exclusion, you'll see, is now becoming a condition of supply for all dairy companies, and so we're going to crack that particular nut. And we're well on the way to understanding more about resource use efficiency so that we're leaching less nitrates and phosphates into waterways. We've got a way to go, but we're I think, pointed in the right direction. And finally, we're working on a whole lot of things across the whole dairy industry. The Clean Streams Accord, which I'm sure you've heard of, expired in 2012, and we have a new accord which will be released within the next month, which will talk about these same issues and set targets for the industry to achieve and show the industry can be a leader in addressing its own environmental challenges. I just thought I'd put this up. One of the things that we hear a lot about is, well, if we know what farmers should do, why don't they do it? Because our experience is that most farmers, once they understand the challenge and the response, they will put it in place. But like all of us, some of us adopt new practices and change more quickly. And one of the things that we have to do is not necessarily work with the early achievers and the fast adopters. We have to get stuck into the people who aren't actually listening that carefully and need more encouragement to adopt changes to make their businesses more sustainable. I said it's simple and it's complicated. I think the biggest complication is that addressing water quality in a particular catchment, in a particular stream, lake or river, it may require different levers to be pulled. In some rivers it may be that there's too much nitrogen, in some rivers it's too much phosphorus, in some rivers it's too much sediment. And we need to make sure that we don't think that there is one cookie cutter approach that we can apply to every waterway in the country, because that's going to add a lot of unnecessary cost into the system, which will undermine our competitiveness. What we've got to do is we've got to work collaboratively with stakeholders and address challenges on waterway by waterway as we go along. I've been deeply involved in something called the Land and Water Forum for the past 4 years, which is all about sitting down collaboratively and saying, we all actually want the same thing. How do we figure out how to do this in a way that optimises both the economic and the environmental outcomes, as well as the social and the cultural? And I think what we did nationally through the Land and Water Forum is going to have to be replicated out there in the regions and there in the catchments. Just to plug, a lot of partnership between our industry and government, particularly in the area of investment and research and development, the Primary Growth Partnership and dairy industry. We have a $170 million program, a lot of which is designed to make the industry more sustainable. Just quickly to touch, one of the things that you will have seen is that from time to time an issue will flare up. You would have seen in the Tuna Lagoon down in Southland there's been some challenges around water quality. Similarly, Lake Rotorua has had some problems. And that's not a bad comparison. Basically what we started to pick up was that people who were living in those regions were very concerned about decline in water quality. In the Tuna Lagoon, the problem is too much sediment and phosphate from farms making their way into the lagoon. So what we've done is gone in there and put in place whole programs to address that particular issue. In Lake Rotorua, though, the problem is too much nitrogen entering the lake. Some of it from the town sewage supply and some of it from farms in the region. So what we've done is put in place a different set of measures up there, and that's a good example of how when you walk into these places where people are concerned about where water quality is declining, first of all you need to diagnose what's going on, who's contributing to the problem, and then you need to work out how to fix it. And that's what we need to do across the whole country. Just to quickly mention, there's a bunch of things I think in terms of what I would call the architecture of the industry response. I've mentioned the new Clean Streams Accord, the Land and Water Forum outcomes. The national policy statement the government passed 2 years ago has been a major driver. What that is basically saying is that all catchments in New Zealand will have water quality limits put in place. And so that becomes now a bottom line that anyone acting in that catchment, whether you're a farmer or a factory or a local town, has to meet the terms of it. And then Supply Frontier, all of the dairy companies are putting in place measures where they can talk to their suppliers to make sure their suppliers are doing the right thing in terms of sustainability. Just quickly to say, we are heading in the right direction. Effluent non-compliance is getting better. Whole farm nutrient management plans across over half the farms in the country. And as I said, as of the end of this coming season, all stock will be excluded from Fonterra farms, and other farms, other dairy farms in the country will be there by 2014. So good progress has been made. Just moving very quickly, I'll just touch on a couple of reasons why I think it's so important that we get this right. If we get it right, we can have a successful dairy industry and a great environment. If we get it wrong, we could be in some trouble. This is just a graph that shows, underlines really how important the dairy industry is for New Zealand. As you can see, getting on for 30% of our merchandise exports come from the dairy industry alone. There's a very strong correlation between gross domestic product and environmental performance. I think it's a really false dichotomy to talk about you can have a good environment or you can have a healthy economy. As this graph shows, it's the countries with the strongest economies that have the best environments. So I think it's something we need to bear in mind. Just another quick graph about the dairy industry's financial impact for the country. 15% of the total GDP of the goods producing industries, over 26% of exports, 45,000 people employed. One of the things I like to talk about in cities is that because the dairy industry is such a strong exporter, it has a major impact on our current account situation. And because our current account determines to a large extent the interest rates at which New Zealand institutions can borrow money from overseas, the mortgage rates that anyone in New Zealand pays on their mortgages is directly impacted by how successful we are as an exporter. So I think it's even for people who feel like they're a million miles away from the agricultural sector, these are issues that really are important to all of us. And we've done some economic modelling that shows, for example, if the dairy payout in New Zealand goes up by $1, every man, woman or child in New Zealand is $270 better off. So there's a very strong connection between how the dairy industry is doing and how the rest of New Zealand's doing. And I think that's one of the reasons we have to get this relationship between the dairy industry and the environment right. We're a bit concerned about cost. There's been, in the same way that there's a housing boom happening in Auckland, there's been a boom happening in the dairy industry in the past 10 years. And there's no question that there's a number of dairy farmers with debt risk out there. That red line shows almost a $6 payout. So anyone to the right of that red line is in financial difficulty. And obviously if payout drops below that 6, you quite quickly find there's more and more farmers getting into trouble. That's real data, by the way. Obviously, we need to be careful, as I said, about putting extra cost into the system. This graph here shows, on the axis up here, it shows the cost competitiveness, and the y-axis shows how much exporting you're doing. You'll see that New Zealand has now become a more expensive place to do dairy farming than Australia. That turned around in the past couple of years, so we're heading in the wrong direction. Obviously, we are significantly more competitive than the EU or the US. But when you see some of these countries, Argentina, Uruguay, Ukraine, down at the left side of the graph, we do have our competitive challenges out there. We can't rest on our laurels that we're always going to be one of the most competitive dairy industries. If we put too much cost into the system, we can get ourselves into trouble. And the opportunity is massive. This graph really just shows projected growth in dairy consumption around the world. And you'll see that that one over on the right there, you see those Asian growth rates, massive rises in dairy consumption. New Zealand is the best dairy producing industry in the world. Across the world there's going to be big market opportunities. So as long as we can get it right, there's a very strong demand picture underpinning our industry for the foreseeable future. As populations grow, as people get wealthier, they want more dairy protein, and that's a very good news story for our industry. So look, I've whipped through that pretty quick, but just to summarise on 3 points, and then I'd love any questions or comments. Certainly we recognise the urgency of addressing our environmental footprint, particularly around water. I'd say it's the single biggest issue at the forefront of industry leadership and strategic thinking at the moment. I've hammered the point about how our responsible, sustainable growth is important to the rest of New Zealand. And really we are committed, we've worked out we need to work as closely as possible with the rest of New Zealand so that we can solve this issue together. Thank you.